Yum, yum!
Hi, and welcome to another episode in the Compositing Bytes series. My name is Alexander Kucera, and today we are going to look at the Penrose triangle. Pedro did show us how he made the assets in Houdini. We are going to look at how to build this compositing setup in Nuke as well as in Fusion, and look at the differences in the setup. So here we are, this is the whole setup. Starting from the top, we have the UV pass Pedro provided for us in two resolutions. This one is the 4K version, and we have the 720p version. The final output is going to be 720p, but I wanted to show you the difference in quality it makes to render out the UV pass in a higher resolution. So first we need to build the whole Penrose triangle. Pedro, for reasons he explains in his video, provided us with just a third of the triangle, so we need to build the other parts. That's easily be accomplished by rotating around the middle of the Penrose triangle by 120 and 240 degrees, and then adding everything together. Down here, I'm just cropping it down a bit so the bounding box stays as small as possible for performance reasons. Here we use the STMap node, which allows us to plug in a color texture, in this case the wood, and a UV texture, and then map the color according to the UVs, which gives us the result we're looking for. The wood mapped onto the Penrose triangle. To move it around, I have this group called wraparound, which is basically just a bunch of transforms that allow me to move my texture wrapping around. If we look inside of that, it's just 4 transforms, and looking at that, you can see the bounding box. We have 4 different transforms, edge to edge, stuck to each other, and then linked to an expression that always makes sure, if we increase the height, for example, as soon as my main translate point reaches the border, it jumps back down. So I can go an infinite amount of wraparounds. And here I'm just animating in X a little movement, which in the STMap node then translates to the wood crawling across the Penrose triangle. If we look at the final result, scaled down to 720p at, say, 300%, and I need to disable this for this to work. So this is the 4K UV texture. If we switch that around to the 720p texture, you can see we lose quite a bit of detail, and the edges just go wonky on us. But over here you can see it's getting quite a bit softer, and here we retain all the nice details. So I'm sticking with the 4K UV texture, even though that's a little bit slower to work with, but it's still reasonably fast. Down here we have the shading pass. We use that to get the alpha from the Penrose triangle. Otherwise the STMap alpha has a few holes in it and isn't quite perfect, so we use the alpha from the shading. We use the bright parts of the shading as a mask to increase the light over here, and we use the dark parts of the shading mask to bring it down over here. So that's our main shading done. And then over here I'm building a fake round edges effect coming in from the UV path. We run a Laplacian filter on it, which gives us this result. I'll explain how the Laplacian works in the Fusion setup, because I'm actually building it out instead of just using a single node. After the Laplacian, we get this result, which we desaturate and grade a bit to get a little bit more punch in the mask. Then we scale it down, giving us nicer edges. And then we are using the shading path again to grade the round edges mask down wherever the shading is darker. So we go from here to here. And then use that to add some nice edge highlights. Then we pre-multiply the whole thing to get rid of the excess color around it and build our little depth effect. Depth effect, I've made it with an expression simply because I'm weird like that. I like my expressions. It's a bunch of multiplications and square roots and divides, and also using a width and a center control. So the basic idea is to get the circle, you'd go the x pixel times the x pixel plus the y pixel times the y pixel and a square root of that. That will give you something like this, which is way too bright. You can see it down here. Because we're using pixel values in the 1280 region, we get huge values. So we can bring that down if we subtract it by some value, let's say 300. So that's now our width, which I linked up here to the width here. So if we use that again, now we have a circle with a width of 640, and to get it smooth, we just divide it by the width as well, and that gives us a nice curve to it. And then if we just factor in the center x and y into the square root calculation, that'll give us ability to position the circle like so. And then I've basically moved the center of the circle around the Penrose triangle. You can see that here. Just moves in a triangle here. Use that as my depth pass with the shuffle. Copy my bounding box back in to keep everything running smoothly. And then use a Z defocus. And then I'm just bringing in the background over here. That's just some random HDR I've grabbed off the HDR Labs archive. You'll receive the already blurred still. If you want to have the animated background, just grab this or any other image that you feel like. To get a little bit more life in here, I'm using a noise. It's just wobbling around, doesn't have to be too fancy. Grade the background with it, so we get some light variation over the time. Then I transform it down so it looks okay when merged over the foreground. Reformat it down to 720p, and then run a defocus over it. So as you can see, when I let that run through, just gives it a little bit more life. And then we use the background to create ourselves a little light wrap. And just merge the two together. And down here it's just a little bit of grain and color correction together with a soft clip, so I'm grabbing all the values in my JPEG render. And that's pretty much it. Looking at the Fusion setup, which is pretty much exactly the same with a few minor differences. We also have the wood. We also use the high-res UV. Do the same 120 and 240 rotation trick. Merge them together, bring the bounding box down, and then use a texture node instead of an ST map. The texture node has the added benefit of having a UV offset built in. So I'm just using that to move the texture around. Then I bring the resolution down to 720p. Use my shading as the alpha and pre-multiply it in one node. Bring the domain back down. Use the shading to light the triangle. And here, this is the rounded edges version in Fusion. Fusion does have a Laplacian filter, but unfortunately you cannot adjust the width, so you're stuck with whatever it gives you, which is not useful. You can try to, I don't know, blur it a bit, but you'll lose just too much information. Instead, what I've done is built my own Laplacian. Laplacian is nothing else than blurring your original image and subtracting it from the original. And you can see that's exactly what the Nuke version looks like. And then we just pick the maximum value, because obviously if you subtract you get negative values. You can see that down here. You get negative values in the color channels as well. We don't want those, so we just pick the maximum value of each channel and then grade it to make it a bit more punchy, bring it down, use the shading again to darken the round edges effect, and then apply that to the triangle. Now we also have the nice round edge effect here. This is the depth effect, again with an expression. I'm using the points and the numbers features in the expression node, but otherwise the expression is pretty much exactly the same. Then I infuse that into the mainstream, bring my bounding box back down, use a depth blur, again bounding box down, and this is my light wrap version in Fusion. Fusion doesn't have a light wrap node, so you have to build your own, and this is one of the many ways to build a light wrap, by doing two bitmaps, one with a blurred alpha, one with the original alpha, and a channel boolean set to exclusive OR. I'm bringing in another bitmap node just to make sure I don't get any values above 1 or below 0 in my masks. And then I have 3 different light wrap widths, which I can apply to the Penrose triangle. For that I divide it first, the alpha divide, then add my light wraps, and then multiply it with the alpha again. And over here I'm also having the apartment HDR, some noise that's similar to the one I've used in Nuke. Here I'm just making sure the white and black is clipped in the noise. I don't want any negative values in my masks again. I'm using that to grade the apartment, transform it down, crop it down to 720, and use a fast defocus, which again brings a little bit of life into the background. I use a Lumic here to get the bright parts of the image to use in my light wrap. And that's what you see here with the light wrap. And then I'm just merging it with the background. Again, just some soft clipping and some film grain And that's it. And that gives you something like this. So I hope you enjoyed this little overview, and you will get all the assets as well as the geometry of the Penrose triangle. You can import that in Fusion and in Nuke to play around with. Maybe use some other channels to see what kind of different effects you can get. And me and Pedro would be interested to see if you come up with any interesting results.
Yum, yum!